Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all doing good today and you're excited about the last unit of our course. In this last unit, we will be talking about fantasy and science fiction. Initially, I wanted to talk about science fiction only, mainly because I love science fiction. But I think it will not be complete to talk about science fiction without talking about fantasy as well. So here it is, a package of fantasy and science fiction. And the topic of my presentation today is that fantasy and science fiction, when we talk about it, when we talk about them, we talk about from the history of writing to the future of technology. That's pretty much what fantasy and science fiction cover. Now, let me share with you my screen so that you can get something to see, which might be beautiful for you. Okay, so as I told you, the topic of my presentation now is science fiction and fantasy from the history of writing to the future of technology. What does it mean? Now, let me explain to you since the beginning. All right. So what do humans write when we started to learn writing? So according to T.A. Shippey, who is a scholar of fantasy works, what humans like to write are, first of all, history, the account of things past or incidents that have happened or people who have played certain roles in history and how history or how things happen in history. That's what people also like to write. In addition to history, people also like to write fiction. Fiction is account or story about things that don't actually happen or things that happened that have been modified or have been processed thanks to humans' imagination. So that's fiction. Now, in addition to fiction, humans also like to write about things that don't actually happen and things that cannot actually happen because they defy the laws of gravity, they defy the laws of physics, and so on. And that's called the fantastic. Now, what we will be talking about today is about the fantastic. What are the forms of the fantastic? What we know now in literature, when we talk about the fantastic, it covers two things. The first one is fantasy. And what is fantasy? Let me give you just one brief definition. Fantasy is any departure from consensus reality. So any story that is not actually like what the reality is. It's very common in all works of literature throughout history. If you know the first literary works that we have uncovered, it's called the Epic of Gilgamesh. It is a work of fantasy. It's about a human with a very great power who has no counterpart, and he asks God, the gods, to give somebody to him. So what we have is Enkidu. Enkidu is a person who is half animal, who is raised by animal, and so on and so forth. So that's the word, that's the first work of literature, which happens to be fantasy. And after fantasy, we also have science fiction. What is science fiction? We will show you several definitions of science fiction, but in general, what we get from Kingsley Amis, a British writer of science fiction works, science fiction is this one, a prose narrative treating a situation that could not arise in the world that we know, but this is the strong point, hypothesized on the basis of some innovation in science or technology. So with a hypothesis or by processing scientific facts or scientific methods, we can create something that cannot actually happen in the real world, possible in the fictional work or fictional world. That's science fiction. Now, let's go deeper into the history. We will now go to science fiction, which happens to be intersect with fantasy. So according to Scott McCracken, there are four generations of science fiction. What are they? The first one is the pre-19th century, in which we have travels and fantasies. Okay, so the earliest works of science fiction were also the works of fantasy. An example would be Gulliver's Travel. I will show you later. And the second one is in the 19th century. During this time, what we got were works in the genre of science fiction, which were actually the reaction to industrial revolution and innovations, the discovery of electricity and how people can create electricity and what things will happen if you run electricity to it. So that's the kind of science fiction works that we had, works that reacted or responded to the industrial revolution and advancement of science in the 19th century. And then we have something else in the late 19th century to early 20th century, science fiction works which as well, which we are quite familiar now. These works were basically inspired by scientific enlightenment and uh, um, efforts to respond to the society as we know now. And later, at the end of the 20th century, we have a different genre of science fiction that respond to a lot other things. For example, high technology with the advance of computer to many other things, all the way to artificial intelligence. I'm sorry, there seems to be a glitch in the file here, but it's okay. Now, this is one example of pre-19th century science fiction. This one, of course, this is a modern rendition of the work. This one is similar to the story of Gulliver's Travel. If you remember Gulliver's Travels, it's about Gulliver, somebody who is a doctor but then turned into a, but then works in a merchant ship. He goes to different islands in his sail trips, and in those different islands, he meets, well, unusual people, unusual creatures. There are islands where there is an island where he meets small people, but there is also an island in which he meets big people. So he is like a miniature human to the people in that island. In another island, he also sees animals that talk, and so on and so forth. So take a look at get the book. It's free online now, so you can read it if you want to. And later on, in the 19th century, as I mentioned to you, works were written by writers in response to the advancement of science and technology and reaction to the Industrial Revolution. One of the greatest works of this era is this one. It's from a novel by Jules Verne, called 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It's about a journey that a person called Captain Nemo takes in his submarine. This one was written before 1850, but they already imagined a submarine that can travel all over the world, seeing parts of the world that people up to now might not know yet. And in addition to that, we also have a lot of things that back then were not real yet. One of the examples was that in that story, the writer talks about a passage from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea without going through Africa. And what does it mean? It means you cut through Egypt. And that's before we had the Suez Canal. Now we have the Suez Canal. It is possible to go from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. But back then, the writer already imagined that there's a passage underground that makes it possible for you to travel from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. All right, now let me continue with an example from late 19th century and early 20th century. This one is by H.G. Wells. It's a book called The Island of Dr. Moreau. It's about a doctor who makes experiments with animals by doing surgeries that later on make the animals able to speak just like human beings. And when animals can speak, they eventually make community and make a society. And that's interesting. This one is inspired by the theory of evolution and many advancements of that era. And H.G. Wells is a very famous science fiction writer whose works I believe you must be familiar with. Works like War of the Worlds, the time traveling, the time machine, and so on, were adapted by from his works. Okay, now let me go to the late 20th century science fiction to the early 21st century. In this era, what we have is not only about mechanical advancement on Earth. What we have here is, well, what we have here ranges from high tech in the forms of computer engineering to travels to other planets or galaxies to the latest one, artificial intelligence. That's a very well, this is a very lively genre now. And in addition to that, you also have many other works that are also inspired by not only natural science or hard sciences, but also from social sciences. How can you make that? How can you make science fiction from social sciences? We will talk about that later. But basically what happens is you play with certain historical facts and put something that makes a change there. And in this era as well, you know what we know as zombies or the apocalypse subgenre. Next, now what is scientific about science fiction? Yeah, why is it called science? It's called science because there is a representation of scientific advancement. We have in science fiction works advancements in technology or the latest discoveries in technology. If we talk about today's science fiction, we have a lot of representation of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is, as you know, something that you use on a daily basis. It helps companies to find out what you like through reading your emails and eventually offer you advertisements based on what you like. That's artificial intelligence. But you can take it to the extreme in the forms of creating robots that have artificial intelligence that eventually can do things other than what you order them to do. So they can have free will and decide for themselves, not you. And later on, why is it called science? Or what's scientific here? It's also because there is the application of scientific methods. What are scientific methods? Basically, when we talk about scientific methods, it means these methods are standard and you can apply that method and get the same result no matter where you apply it. So in science fiction works, we have the application of certain methods in science, but the writers tweak the method so that something amazing or something unusual can come up from the process. And one example for this is the use of cloning, for example. Cloning is a method in science to create an individual from the DNA of one individual. That's what happens. In a science fiction work, in, say, the novel Jurassic Park, in the Jurassic Park, what we have is the method of cloning is applied, but this time not on the DNA of a lamb or a frog, but the DNA of a dinosaur that has been preserved in an amber or preserved in stone. That's what they get by tweaking or by getting the DNA of a dinosaur. What the movie can present us is real life dinosaur here in the world in this era. And last thing is that it doesn't have to be from natural sciences. It can also be from social sciences. One example for this is a work by Philip K. Dick called The Man in the High Tower. That book is about a time in history, is about today's era in which the United States is well occupied by half the Japanese and half the German. Why is it happening? How can that be possible? It turns out that in the novel, one of the elements of history, which is the victory of the Allied forces against the Axis, didn't happen. So the United States didn't drop bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Allied forces didn't win the war, so that another group was winning. So that's what we get. So the United States is now conquered by the Japanese and the German. All right. Now let's talk about the important concepts in science fiction. We will go mostly on science fiction now. There are three topics that I want to touch upon here. The first two are from Darko. It's called Novum and Cognitive Estrangement. And the second one, oh my God, there's a problem again. It's Utopia and Dystopia by Frederick Jameson. All right, now let's go to this explanation about Novum and cognitive estrangement. Now we go to Novum. What is Novum? Novum is something that you can find in science fiction in which there is a new discovery or a new element provided to you. This new element makes things that otherwise are not possible become possible. So this is a new knowledge or new science. That's why the word novum, nova means new. Introduced in the movie or in the novel that makes story reasonable. Okay, although actually they are not possible. Like creating dinosaurs. It is not possible today to have dinosaurs. But the movie, The Jurassic Park, or the novel, The Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton, shows us something new. What is it? Which is getting the DNA of dinosaurs from stones and then clone the DNA. That's the novum. The ability to extract DNA is the novum in this one. If we talk about movies like the Black Panther, for example, for the Black Panther, it is possible for Wakanda to protect itself, to create advanced technology in the jungle of Africa. Why is it possible? It's because they have the vibranium deposit in the earth. So this vibranium deposit is the novum there, and the ability to extract that vibranium and use it to create something that's also the new thing, the novum of that story. Now, with that novum, we can create a different world, making sense. And this new world is part of the cognitive estrangement. So cognitive estrangement comes from the word cognition, which is the effort to make sense of something, the effort to understand something, and estrangement, the process of turning something familiar into unfamiliar, or the situation that is unusual. So with the novum, the word which is otherwise unusual becoming possible or understandable. That's cognitive estrangement. There is a strange world presented to you, but you can still understand it, you can still make sense of it because of that new thing. The presence of dinosaurs today is not possible, but thanks to the ability to extract DNA from rocks, then what is otherwise impossible becoming possible. Yep. Cognitive estrangement is the process of creating a sense of strangeness, but still understandable. Okay. Now, according to Darko Suvin, let me now read this quote from Darko Suvin, which I hope will stick with you. Science fiction is a literary genre whose necessary and sufficient conditions are the presence and interactions of estrangement and cognition. So there is a presence and there is an interaction between estrangement, the feeling of strangeness, and cognition, the ability to understand it. So this is what mainly distinguishes science fiction from fantasy, according to Darko Suvin. There is a strangeness, but there is also the ability to understand that strangeness, the ability to make sense of that strangeness. The main formal device is an imaginative framework alternative to the author's empirical environment, and that is the novum. Okay, so remember, the main characteristic of science fiction that distinguishes it from fantasy is the presence of estrangement, but then cognition. A strange world, but still made possible by the logic there, by the novum. Now, the second concept that I wanted to propose is one by Frederick Jameson. It's called Utopia or dystopia there. So in science fiction, utopia has been present since way before the work of science fiction alone is present. Utopia is one concept offered by Sir Thomas More in the book Utopia. It's about one place which is the most ideal place where things are what we want. It's a combination of the word utopia, a happy place, and utopia. So utopia is actually an idealized place that actually is not present. In science fiction, utopia is usually a way to call a nice place, a good place in the future where things are good. However, this better future is usually used to criticize our condition now. If there is a situation which is bad now, then the utopia is what we get. And writers usually like not using utopia, but dystopia. Writers imagine a future or a present where things are so bad, and they are actually to criticize our condition today. They are usually the hyperbolic version of our situation in this era. All right, now let me go. Let me skip some parts to go to the subgenres of science fiction and fantasy. What are the subgenres? We can tell you some here. We have alien civilization, we have alien invasion, and we have alternative history, a history which is different from our current history. I mentioned to you work by um, Philip K. Dick called A Man in the High Tower. That's an alternative history work. In the novel, what we get is not the United States as we know now, but a country occupied by the Japanese and the German, because the United States didn't win World War II. Apocalypse, we have a lot of apocalypses, from zombie apocalypse in Train to Busan, or The Walking Dead, to the robot apocalypse, like the new Netflix film. You have what is it? The Mitchells and the Machine. That's an apocalypse. Artificial intelligence, about robots or a computer that eventually can get consciousness and overpower humans. We have examples of that. Catastrophe, cyberpunk. It's one of the best examples is Tron, the Legacy, about a man who goes to the world of the computer to save his father. Dystopia is the opposite of utopia. If utopia is an idealized future or idealized place, dystopia is the opposite. It's a world where things are bad, and we don't have much options and we have to fight. The movie The Snowpiercer is a dystopian novel about a world that has turned into another ice age, that has gone to another ice age, and people live in a train. That's a dystopian work. We have Galactic Empire, heroic fantasy, high fantasy. I will explain to you later about high fantasy and heroic fantasy. Medieval future, it's about future but set in the medieval era. That's unusual. Mythological super being, these are mostly fantasy works. Time travel. Now, a dystopian work, as I mentioned to you, is the opposite of dystopia. This is an image taken from a movie adapted from the book by Cormac McCarthy called The Road. It's about a father and son who go to the south to find peace. I'm really sorry. I think I have mostly used men dominated movies and books here, right? Okay, I should. Well, the Mitchells is not men dominated. And this one is a heroic fantasy. So heroic fantasy is a fantasy work set in a fantasy world, and the characters are, they are dealing with a lot of problems in life, epic scale plots and epic scale conflicts, and they have the combination of sword and sorcery, and sometimes even dragons. And this series adapted from the book The Game of Thrones is a good example that you can find out now. Another high fantasy is this kind of work has little connection to the world, but this one doesn't have to include like epic scale problems like the Game of Thrones. Okay, sometimes they have dragons, and that is very common in high fantasy. Sometimes they live in another world with a lot of sophisticated weaponry and so on. Now, what are the themes? Well, the themes are, as usual, pretty unlimited. It's ranging from the idea that family love trumps everything to artificial intelligence can eventually lead to the destructions of human beings. So there's a lot, and that's your job to find out the theme of your science fiction or fantasy work. The Game of Thrones is about, I think, power can blind people, and when people are blinded by power, they don't care about what's most important for them. Well, that's my interpretation. All right, everyone. I hope that is enough to give you a background of fantasy and science fiction. I'm looking forward to seeing what you like about science fiction and fantasy, and I would like to hear your take on themes of your favorite science fiction works. Right? Thank you, everyone. Bye.